The Breath had been watching humanity for 60 years. They watched from the edges of their sensor arrays from deep space observation platforms that drifted silent and dark just beyond the boundaries of human territory. They watched from the quiet of their war councils on Breath Prime, where the Emperor's generals spread holographic maps across long stone tables and pointed at small clusters of light and called them targets. What they saw was a young species barely 400 years into space travel. 17 colony worlds, one home planet, a military force that was decent by the standards of smaller civilizations, but laughable compared to the Vreth Empire, which had been conquering worlds since before humans had discovered fire. The Wreath Council of Five reached a conclusion that seemed obvious to everyone in that chamber. Humans were weak. Emperor Chaoth sat at the head of the table and listened to his generals present the war plan with the particular satisfaction of a man who has already decided and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He was old, nearly 900 years old, which was elderly even for a Breath, a species that lived long and remembered everything and held grudges for centuries. His skin was the deep blue-gray of deep ocean stone. His 4 copper-colored eyes moved slowly around the room as his general spoke, resting on each face for exactly long enough to make that person feel seen and evaluated. He had fought 14 wars. He had lost none of them. General Oryx stood at the front of the chamber beside the star map and delivered his briefing in the precise, clipped manner that had made him the finest military mind in the Empire. Oryx was tall even for a Breath, angular and spare, with the kind of stillness that comes from total self-control. He had spent his entire career studying wars, every war in the Breath historical record, and every war he could find documentation of from the 37 other species the Empire had absorbed. He had read about humans specifically. He had read everything. The United Earth Defense Corps maintains approximately 1,400 active warships, Oryx said. Of those, roughly 800 are combat-rated. The rest are patrol and support vessels. Their largest warship class, the Titan series carrier, is formidable within its class, but not exceptional by our standards. He moved his pointer across the map. Their colony worlds are spread along this corridor. New Carthage is the outermost and the most resource-rich. It is also the least defended. How long? The Emperor asked. To neutralize all 17 colonies and force a surrender agreement. Oryx paused. 6 months, possibly less. Calavoth looked at the map for a long moment. He looked at the thin scatter of human worlds beside the vast, deep spread of his own empire. He thought about the trade corridors the humans controlled, the mineral deposits, the strategic positioning. He thought about how much easier it would be to simply take those things than to negotiate for them. He said, "Begin." He was wrong about the 6 months. He was wrong about almost everything. The first attack came on a Tuesday morning. It came to New Carthage first, because New Carthage was the closest human world to birth space, and because it had the second largest mining operation in the outer colonies. 312,000 people lived there in pressurized dome cities, and deep-cut underground settlements, and small agricultural communities spread across the valleys between the Great Crater Ranges. They went to work, and raised children, and watched sports, and argued about local council elections, and did all the ordinary things that people do when they believe the universe is mostly safe. The Breath fleet came out faster than light travel at 3:40 in the morning local time. The automated defense grid detected them in the first seconds. Alerts fired through every military channel. Station Commander Yuki Tanaka was at her post within 4 minutes, sitting at her console in the orbital defense hub, staring at a sensor readout that simply did not make sense to her because she had never seen that many hostile contacts on a single screen in her entire career. She counted, stopped, counted again. 467 ships, her second officer said quietly because someone had to say it out loud. Tanaka had 6 orbital defense platforms and 42 UEDC warships. She sent the distress signal to Earth. She sent it to every UEDC command post within communication range. She sent it with the full sensor data attached, the coordinates, the enemy ship classifications, everything. Because if New Carthage was not going to survive this, the least she could do was make sure the people who came after understood exactly what they were facing. Then she gave the order to fight. The breath ships were enormous. The smallest were the size of ocean-going carriers. The largest, the dreadnoughts that moved at the center of the formation, slow and gray and absolutely massive, were nearly 4 kilometers long from bow to stern. They moved without hurry. They moved the way something moves when it has no reason to be afraid. The first shot was fired at 4:12 in the morning. New Carthage was held for 9 hours. Tanaka's final transmission was received at UEDC Command in Geneva at 1:17 in the afternoon Earth time. It was 31 seconds long. The last thing she said with the sound of the defense hub tearing apart behind her was, "Hold the line. Whatever you do, hold the line." The channel went dead. The breath orbital bombardment began 4 minutes later. The news reached Earth in real time. The quantum communication network carried everything. Battle reports, sensor data, distress calls, the raw footage from defense platform cameras that kept recording automatically, even after the human operators were gone. Every screen on Earth carried it. Every news feed, every public display in every city on every continent. People stopped on sidewalks and stood in front of shop windows and watched the footage from New Carthage and did not speak. Secretary General Amara Diallo received the first full report in her office in Nairobi at 6 a.m. in the morning. She was 61 years old, a former military attorney, a woman who had built her career on the slow and grinding work of keeping the various governments of Earth pointed in roughly the same direction. She read the report once very fast and then once more very slowly. Then she called Admiral Haruto Shen at UEDC Command. "Tell me it's not as bad as the report says." She said it's worse. Shen told her his voice was very level. "New Carthage is gone. Kepler Station is under attack. We're getting contact reports from the Proxima settlements and Meridian colony. They hit 6 locations simultaneously. General Secretary, this is not a border incident. This is a war." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, Nairobi was waking up in the early light, and she thought about all the people in that city who did not yet know what was happening, who were making coffee and getting dressed and planning ordinary days. "How many ships?" she asked. "Our best current estimate is between 2,500 and 3,000 across all attack vectors." She set down the report. "Call the Security Council," she said. "Call everyone." The first week ended with 4 human colony worlds lost and over 11,000 UEDC personnel dead. The numbers were staggering. Nothing in human military history compared to them. People who had lived through the worst conflicts of the 22nd century, the Martian Secession War, the Belt conflicts, said they had never seen anything like it. The losses were not just large, they were systematic, efficient. The Verith moved from target to target with the calm, organized precision of a very old empire that had done this many times before. But something about the Vreth campaign was interesting if you looked at it carefully. They were not destroying everything. They were destroying military assets, defense platforms, UDC warships, weapon depots, communication infrastructure, civilian structures. They left mostly intact. The domed cities of New Carthage still stood. The agricultural settlements were untouched. The mines were occupied rather than bombed. This was not mercy. It was inventory management. The births were not conquering human worlds. They were acquiring them. General Aura sent daily reports to the Emperor, and the Emperor read them with satisfaction, and the Council of Five began discussing how to divide the human territories among the noble houses. The imperial media ran feature stories about the inevitable surrender. Generals who had commanded the early assaults gave long interviews about the weakness of human defenses and the speed of the campaign. Victory parties were held in the capital. Orax attended these parties. He said the correct things. He raised his glass at the correct moments. At night in his quarters, he read the intercepted human transmissions. There was something in them that troubled him. He could not name it precisely at first, so he read them again and again. He read the communications between human military commanders, between ship captains and admirals and government officials. He looked for the pattern he was used to seeing in a losing side, the tone of desperation, The negotiating language. The quiet opening of diplomatic backchannels that always preceded a formal surrender request. He did not find it. What he found instead were words like *inventory, *production capacity, ** manufacturing output reserve stockpiles. He found discussions of shipyard expansion, of accelerated training programs, of resource allocation for long-term military buildup. The humans were counting what they had left, so they could decide what to offer in surrender. So they could decide what they could build with it. Commander Elena Vasquez had been 90 days into a deep space survey mission when the war began. She received the emergency broadcast on the science vessel * Perseverance and gathered her crew of 42 in the common room, and they watched the footage from New Carthage together without speaking. Vasquez was 38 years old. She had served 8 years in the UEDC before moving to the Exploration Corps, and she carried her military training the way some people carry old injuries. You could not see it most of the time, but it was always there, shaping how she moved and thought and made decisions. She watched the footage and felt what everyone felt. That heavy, sinking, sick feeling that has no good name. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was about 30 seconds. Then she opened a channel to UEEDC Command and reported her position and offered her ship and her crew. Command redirected her to Fort Hestus, a deep space repair and resupply station in the outer systems that was being rapidly converted into something much larger. When Perseverance docked at Fort Hestus, 16 days later, Vasquez walked off the ship and stopped on the docking bay floor and just looked. The place was packed in a way that made no immediate sense to her because she knew its normal capacity, and this was far beyond it. Ships of every classification, destroyers, frigates, carriers, converted mining vessels, and cargo haulers with gun mounts welded to their hulls by crews who clearly had more urgency than experience were docked or queuing in the approach lanes. The corridors were full of people moving fast and talking fast. The sound of construction came from every direction at once, a constant background roar of cutting tools and welding rigs and heavy machinery. A junior officer met her at the dock and handed her a data pad and said that Admiral Shen wanted to see her. She read the briefing summary as she walked. She read it slowly because she wanted to make sure she understood it correctly. Admiral Shen's office was a small room made smaller by the charts and data pads covering every surface. The Admiral himself looked like a man who had been running on no sleep and sheer determination for weeks, which was exactly what he had been doing. He waved her to a seat across from his desk without ceremony. "I read your service record," he said. "You're good at working with incomplete information in unfamiliar environments." "I try to be," she said. "We're going to need that." He leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. "I'm going to tell you something that is not in the public reports, and will not be for some time. The best think they've already won this war." Their emperor gave a speech to the Imperial Council last week, declaring that human military resistance has been effectively broken. He said, according to the Intercept, that the surrender would come within 60 days. Vasquez said nothing. She waited. "He is wrong," Shen said. "But we need him to stay wrong about that for as long as possible. We need him to keep celebrating while we do what we need to do." He looked at her steadily. "Every shipyard in human space is running at full capacity right now. We're pulling resources from every colony we still hold. We're training pilots faster than we ever have before. We are building the largest military force in human history, and we are doing it quietly and quickly. And when it is ready," he stopped. "When it is ready," Vasquez said. Shen looked at the star maps on his wall, at the deep, wide spread of breath space, at the long corridor of human worlds beside it, battered and reduced. "The breath wanted a war," he said. "They're going to get one. They just don't know yet what kind." On Breath Prime, the Emperor received another round of victory reports and was very pleased with how things were going. In a deep space station at the edge of human territory, Elena Vasquez read her briefing packet a second time and understood the shape of what was being built. In his quarters, General Orax read a 3-word transmission fragment from a human captain whose ship had been destroyed defending Kepler Station. The captain had said in the last seconds before her vessel broke apart, "We are not done." Oryx read those 3 words for a long time. He had spent his career studying wars, and he had very good instincts, and his instincts were telling him something that he did not want to tell his emperor. The humans were not broken. They were angry. And in his experience, of all the things a species could be in a war, anger was the most dangerous. 7 months after the fall of New Carthage, the Verith Empire received its first real surprise. It did not come in the form of a diplomatic message, or a surrender request, or an opening bid for peace negotiations. It came in the form of 420 UDC warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel, directly on top of a VTH supply line in the Kesper system. 60 light-years inside what the Empire had already begun calling acquired human territory. The Vreth garrison had 36 ships. They were not combat-ready because nobody had told them to be. There had been no intelligence indicating any human military activity in the region. The Empire surveillance network showed that human military forces were scattered, reduced, and retreating. The war was practically over. The garrison commander was in the middle of a meal when the alert sounded. He had enough time to send a distress signal. Then the UADC fleet hit them. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Admiral Shen had specifically chosen the Kespar supply line for the first strike because it was logistically important to the Breth occupation forces, and because losing it would not just hurt them materially, it would confuse them. It would make them ask questions. When you surprise an enemy that believes it has already won, the first thing you break is not their fleet. It is their certainty. The strike lasted 40 minutes. When it was done, the garrison was gone, the supply depot was gone, the fueling platforms were gone, and the 420 UEDC ships were already back in faster-than-light transit, moving to the next target on the list. They had 300 more targets on the list. Vasquez commanded the second strike at the Breth Communication Relay Station in the Outer Meridian. She had spent 6 months at Fort Histus, doing the kind of work she was good at, sitting with incomplete maps and partial intelligence, and figuring out which gaps mattered most and how to fill them. She had been given a team of 12 analysts and a mandate to build the most accurate picture possible of Breth military logistics in the occupied territories. What she found was a system that was very large and very powerful, but not especially flexible. The VHT had been conquering civilizations for thousands of years, and they were extremely good at it. Their fleets were massive, their weapons were excellent, their coordination in open battle was near perfect, but their supply chains were built for a war that was already over because they had always assumed it would be over. They had assumed the humans would fold quickly, and they had planned accordingly. They had not planned for what happened if the humans did not fold. They have exactly 12 communication relay stations that are critical to the coordination of their occupation fleet, Vasquez told Admiral Shen 3 days before the Kespar operation. She pointed to the map. If you take out 4 of these in rapid sequence, you don't just slow their communications, you create gaps in their command structure. The occupation commanders in each region start acting independently. They stop coordinating, and independent commanders make independent decisions, which means mistakes. Shen had looked at the map for a long time. How confident are you in this analysis? Confident enough to volunteer to lead one of the strike teams myself? She said he had given her a destroyer group. 7 ships, fast and lean, built for exactly this kind of operation. She took them to the Outer Meridian relay station and dismantled it in 11 minutes. On the way out, her sensor officer reported 3 Breth patrol ships responding to the alert. Vasquez looked at her tactical display. The patrol ships were close. They were large. Under normal circumstances, a 7-ship destroyer group would avoid that engagement. "Turn us around," she said. Her helm officer paused. "Commander, turn us around. We have 7 ships. We were surprised. Take the engagement." They took the engagement. They lost 1 ship. They destroyed all 3 VHT patrol vessels and were back in FTL transit before any further response could arrive. Vasquez sat in the captain's chair afterward and thought about the 41 crew members on the destroyer they had lost. She thought about each of them for a moment, And then she set that aside the way she had learned to set things aside because she could not afford to hold it right now. Later, she thought later when this was over. She sent the engagement report to Shen. He sent back 3 words. Keep going harder. The Verith High Command received the Kespar report and was confused. This was new in their history. A species at the point of collapse did not launch multi-hound ship offensive operations against occupied territories. A species at the point of collapse asked for terms. It went quiet. It sent envoys. It did not attack a supply line with 400 ships and then vanished. General Orax was in the command center when the reports from Kespar, and then the Outer Meridian, and then 3 more strike locations came in within the same 18-hour period. He stood at the central display and read each one, and felt the cold thing at the back of his mind grow larger and heavier. These are not desperate raids, he said to the room, though he was really talking to himself. A junior intelligence officer looked up at him. General, desperate raids hit the targets that are available, Orax said. They hit whatever they can reach, whatever represents the best chance of escape or survival, he gestured at the display. These targets are not available or easy. They are specifically chosen. Each one of these strikes hits something that damages our operational capacity in a precise way. This is a coordinated campaign. Somebody mapped our logistics and found the load-bearing points. The junior officer looked at the display and began to understand what the general was saying. How many ships do they have? The officer asked quietly. Orax had been asking himself that exact question for a week. He did not have a good answer. The intelligence picture he had was 3 months old. He had assumed, as everyone had assumed, that the human military was in retreat and decline. He was beginning to suspect that assumption was dangerously wrong. Find out, he said. Find out immediately. He went to the Emperor's chamber that night and stood in front of Kaoth and said what he had been trying to say for months. My Emperor, he said, I believe we may have miscalculated the scope of human military recovery. The Emperor looked at him with those 4 copper eyes and said very calmly, You have read your reports wrong, General. The humans are finished. This is noise. Orax wanted to push harder. He had all his intelligence laid out in his head, all the intercepted transmissions, all the pattern analysis, all the things he had been watching for months that pointed in a direction nobody wanted to look. He said, Of course, my Emperor, and left the chamber. Outside in the corridor alone, he stood still for a moment. The Emperor was wrong. He was almost certain of it. He began writing his own report separate from the official channel because he needed someone to read it who would listen. The UEDC's public name for the campaign was Operation Long Memory. Internally, among the pilots and crew and commanders who flew it, it had a different name. They called it Payback Season. The name spread from ship to ship the way names do organically through mess hall conversations and permission briefings, and the specific dark humor that develops in a military community that has been through something terrible and is now finally being pointed in the direction of the people who caused it. The pilots who flew Payback Season were a specific kind of human. They were the ones who had been at New Carthage, or who had lost someone at New Carthage, or who had pulled a survivor out of a debris field at Kepler Station, or who had watched their first posting get turned into an occupied colony at the start of the war. They were not flying for abstract strategic goals. They were flying because of something specific and personal and unresolved that they carried in their chests every day. Admiral Shen had noticed this during the training cycles. He had noted that these pilots flew differently from the ones who came in fresh with no direct experience of the early losses. They were more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more effective in almost every engagement metric. He did not try to moderate this. He put them at the front. 43 days into Payback Season, UEDC forces retook the Meridian colony. It was the first human colony liberated since the war began. The operation took 72 hours of continuous fighting, the toughest sustained combat of the campaign so far. The Breath garrison was larger than expected, and they fought effectively, and they made the UEDC pay for every kilometer, but the UED paid for it. When the last Breath warship in the system was destroyed, and the colony was declared liberated. Vasquez was in her ship's command center watching the sensor display, and the entire crew around her was quiet for a moment, not celebrating yet, just sitting with it. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was on their feet, and the sound was enormous in that small space, and Vasquez let it go on for a full minute before she called. She opened a system-wide channel and hailed the colony. A voice came back, a civilian voice, rough and exhausted, from the colony administrator who had been managing life under breath occupation for 7 months. "Are you UEEDC?" the voice said. It had the particular quality of someone who was trying very hard not to sound like they were about to cry. "We are," Vasquez said. A long pause then. "We have wounded. We have a lot of wounded and we need food." "We have both," Vasquez said. "We're coming in." She cut the channel and looked at the star map on her display at the one small dot that had just changed from occupied to liberated at the 16 other occupied dots. Then the stars beyond the occupied territory, the vast, deep reach of breath space. 43 days in, and they had one colony back. But it was a beginning. On Breath Prime, the Emperor finally stopped calling the human operations noise after the Meridian liberation. He called an emergency session of the Council of Five. And for the first time in the war, he looked slightly less than completely certain. "How?" he said. His voice was level, but his 4 eyes were moving in the way they moved when he was recalculating something. "We had a garrison of 800 ships in that system. How did they take it?" Nobody in the room had a clean answer. Orax had his report ready. He laid it on the table in front of the Emperor. 7 months of analysis. Everything he had seen. All of it. "They were never broken," Orax said quietly. "They were building my Emperor." "They have been building an invasion force for 7 months, and we have been watching victory celebrations while they did it." Kelvoth looked at the report. He looked at Orax. He looked around the room at the other members of the Council of Five, who were all very carefully looking at other things. "How many ships do they have now?" he asked. Orax told him the estimate. The Emperor was very quiet for a long time. "Send more garrisons to the outer occupied worlds," he said finally. "Double the defensive positions on the inner border." Orax said very carefully, "My Emperor, that will help, but I do not think it is sufficient. The trajectory of their operations suggests double the defensive positions." Kaoth said his voice had the specific quality of a voice that does not want to hear anything else on this subject right now. Orax said, "Yes, my Emperor." He left the chamber and walked down the long corridor and stood outside in the cold night air of Breath Prime and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there in the deep dark between worlds, human ships were moving. He could not see them. He could not track them precisely, but they were coming. He had read what the human commanders said to their crews. He had read the speeches and the broadcasts and the intercepted mission briefings. He had read the transmissions from the crews who had liberated Meridian Colony, the messages they sent back to Earth afterward. The humans were not fighting to defend anymore. They were fighting to take back what was theirs. And after that, and this was the part that gave Orax a very cold feeling in the middle of his chest, they would not stop at their own borders. He knew this the way you know things after studying warfare for 400 years. You do not build what the humans were building just to reclaim your own territory. You build it to go further. Much further. The liberation of New Carthage took 11 days, not 9 hours, the way the VR had taken it. 11 days of the hardest sustained orbital and ground combat the UEDC had yet conducted. The VHTH had fortified the system heavily after losing Meridian Colony. They had tripled the garrison of the previous year. They had reshaped the orbital approach lanes with defensive platforms and minefield grids and coordinated fire patterns designed by their best military engineers. Admiral Shen had 3,000 ships. He spent 11 days dismantling the Verith defenses piece by piece. He lost ships. He lost crews. He accepted every loss as the price of something that needed to be done. And he kept going. When it was over and the last breath held out in the underground tunnel networks had been cleared by UEDC ground forces, the human soldiers walked out through the domed city of New Carthage and stood in its streets. The city was mostly intact. The breath had maintained it, as they maintained all their occupied assets clean, functional, operational. The buildings were fine. The transit systems were working. The power grid was running. It looked exactly like a human city, except that no humans had lived freely in it for over a year. A UEDC private name stood in the main square of New Carthage and looked at the breath flag still hanging from the government buildings. He looked at them for a while. Then he found a ladder and climbed up and tore them down one by one. His sergeant watched him do it and did not tell him to stop. They found a stored New Carthage municipal flag in a maintenance closet. Someone hung it from the highest point they could reach. Vasquez watched the footage from the surface feed in her command center and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a long time. She did not name the feeling. She just sat with it for a moment and then returned to her tactical displays. There were 14 more worlds on the list. The pace of the campaign had shifted by the time New Carthage fell. It was no longer a series of precision strikes against supply lines and communication relays. That phase had served its purpose. It had disrupted the Vreth occupation network, created gaps in their command structure, forced them to consolidate and pull resources inward. It had bought the time needed to complete what Shen had been building. What he had been building was ready. The UEDC fleet was now larger than it had ever been in human history. The shipyards had run continuously for over a year. Every manufacturing facility that could be converted to warship production had been converted. Civilian shipbuilders, mining corporations, private contractors, all of them folded into the war effort under the Emergency Mobilization Act that the UN Security Council had passed in the third week of the war. Every human world that remained free had contributed everything it could. Resources, personnel, ships, technology. It was not a fleet built for defense. It was a fleet built for what came after defense. Shen gave a briefing to the full command council 6 days after the liberation of New Carthage. He stood in front of a galaxy map that showed the current state of the war. 7 human worlds were liberated, 10 still under breath occupation and beyond the occupation zone, the deep reach of breath space itself. The occupied worlds are winnable, he said. We have the ships and the planning to take them back. We will take them back. He paused. But I want to address something that has not been in our official strategic documents because it needed to wait until we were certain of our capability. We are now certain. The room was very quiet. The Verith Empire attacked human territory without provocation, without warning, and without any diplomatic process. They killed over 200,000 of our people in the first week alone. They occupied our worlds for more than a year. They did this because they calculated that we were too weak to stop them. He looked around the room. They were wrong. And there needs to be a cost for that miscalculation. A cost that the VHT Empire understands. A cost that every other civilization in this galaxy can look at and understand. He paused again. We are not stopping at our own border. He said we are going in. The news that the UEDC intended to cross into VHT space and carry the war to the Empire itself reached Emperor Chaoth through 3 different intelligence channels within hours of each other. His reaction, according to every account from people who were in the chamber that day, was the closest he had come to losing his composure in 300 years of rule. He did not shout. He was not a man who shouted. He went very still in the way that very powerful, very old beings go still, when the world has just done something that contradicts their fundamental model of how it works. Then he said very quietly, "They cannot." Oryx, who was standing 6 FT away, said nothing, because he had been saying they can in various forms for over a year, and the Emperor had not listened. And saying it again now seemed like the wrong approach. They cannot cross into Imperial territory, Ka said again. And this time he was looking at Oryx, because Oryx was the one in the room whose job it was to tell him true things. The Empire has 240 worlds. Their entire fleet has grown considerably. My Emperor Aurochs said carefully. How considerably? Aurochs told him. The Emperor was quiet for a very long time. Open a diplomatic channel, he said at last. We will negotiate a settlement, return the colonies, reparations if necessary, a formal end to hostilities. Aurochs said, Yes, my Emperor. He sent the message. He sent it through every diplomatic channel available. Through neutral, third-party civilizations, through back channels, through every network he could access. He sent it formally with the full weight of the imperial seal. The response came back from Secretary-General Diallo through the UN diplomatic office in 4 hours. It was brief. The United Earth government acknowledges receipt of the Breath Empire's communication. We declined to enter negotiations at this time. We will communicate further terms when we are ready to do so. Kath read the response 3 times. When they were ready, he said slowly, Yes, my Emperor. They are dictating the terms of a negotiation to the Vareth Empire. Aurochs said nothing because, yes, that was exactly what the humans were doing. The campaign to retake the remaining human worlds moved fast and with enormous force. Shen had learned from every engagement of the past year. He knew how the Vreth garrison commanders thought, how they organized their defenses, and how they responded to simultaneous multi-vector pressure. He knew their communication protocols well enough to fake them, their resupply timing well enough to intercept it, and their tactical preferences well enough to predict them. Vasquez led the liberation of 4 colonies in 6 weeks. She ran her command the way she had run everything in this war, lean, fast, and completely unwilling to accept a problem that had a solution. She slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of her time at her tactical displays or in briefings or walking the corridors of her flagship talking to the crew. She had learned that a crew who sees their commander in the corridors, who talks to them about ordinary things, fights differently than a crew that only hears their commander's voice over the intercom. She asked people about their families. She remembered their names. She knew which of her pilots had been at New Carthage and which had come in fresh. She did not treat them differently for it, but she knew. In the 6th week, they liberated a colony called Harvest Station, a small agricultural world with 60,000 residents. The colony had been under occupation longer than any of the others, 18 months. When the UEDC ground forces secured the main settlement, the residents came out into the streets and the soldiers walked among them. And for a little while, for just a little while, everyone stopped thinking about what was coming next. A little girl gave towards the private who had torn down the breath flags at New Carthage a handmade paper flower. He kept it in his breast pocket for the rest of the war. The last occupied human colony, a mining world called Pharaoh's Rock, was liberated on a Friday morning, 14 months after the war began, when the final VHTH garrison ship was destroyed and the all clear was broadcast. Something happened across the UEDC fleet that no one had planned and no one could have predicted. Every ship in the fleet that had a working communication transmitter opened a channel simultaneously, not in coordination, not by order. Every ship just did it at once. And for 3 seconds, the communication bands were full of human voices. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, shouting and laughing and crying all at the same time. Shen stood on his flagship's bridge and listened to it for those 3 seconds. Then he said quietly to the communications officer, "Send the order to reform the carrier groups. We will move in 4 hours." The communications officer said very steadily, "Yes, Admiral." The order went out. The celebration ended. The fleet turned, not inward, not back toward human space, outward toward the border, toward the deep dark of Breath territory, which began 40 light years away and ran for 200 more. On Breath Prime, General Aurochs stood in the war room and watched the sensor data come in from the border stations. The human fleet had cleared the last occupied human world. They were reforming. Their vector was becoming clear. He had a full picture now. He had spent the last 3 months ordering every intelligence asset he had toward the task of building the most accurate estimate possible of the human fleet size and capability. He had argued with his analysts. He had cross-checked the numbers 6 times. He had made them check again. The numbers were right. He went to the Emperor's chamber. Kalivoth was at his desk reading reports, 4 eyes moving rapidly across the text. He looked up when Oryx entered, and there was something new in those eyes, something that had not been there before this war. It was not quite scary. The Emperor did not feel fear in the ordinary sense. It was something closer to the feeling of a man who is very good at mathematics looking at an equation that does not behave the way mathematics says it should. "They're coming," Oryx said. He said it as plainly as he could because he was done with diplomatic cushioning. The full fleet, all of it. Admiral Shen's vector puts them on our inner border worlds in approximately 3 weeks. Our defensive capability is not sufficient. Oryx said, "My Emperor, I have to say this clearly. We are not in a position to stop them. Not here. Not on the inner border. We have stripped our garrison forces to reinforce the occupied worlds that they have already taken back. We have spent a year's worth of munitions and fuel and ship components on an occupation campaign that is now over. Our navy is weakened and dispersed, and their navy is—" He stopped, choosing his next word carefully. "Their navy is angry." The silence in the room was very deep. "Then we negotiate," Kalivoth said. "We have tried to negotiate. They declined. Then we negotiate harder. We offer more. We offer reparations, territory concessions, and trade agreements." "My Emperor, Oryx," said very quietly, "I do not think they want reparations." Kath looked at him. "What do they want?" Oryx had been thinking about this for a long time. He had read every human transmission, every speech, every broadcast. He had read the Secretary General's statements and the Admiral's briefings, and the messages the soldiers sent home to their families. He had tried to understand as precisely as he could what motivated a species that fought like this, that came back like this, that turned a defeat into a 7,000 ship invasion force. "I think," Oryx said carefully, "that they want to make sure this never happens again." The Emperor said nothing. "And I think," Oryx continued, "that the way they intend to guarantee that is by coming here to this world and making it very clear to us and to every other civilization, watching what happens when you start a war with humanity." The room was very quiet for a very long time. Outside the tall windows of the Emperor's chamber, Breath Prime lay spread beneath the night sky. The capital city glittered below. The gardens of the imperial complex stretched out in the darkness, old and beautiful, and tended for centuries. Kath looked at it all and said nothing. Oryx waited. "Prepare the core world defenses," the Emperor said at last. "Recall every available ship to the inner systems. We will stop them at the border of the home territories." "Yes, my Emperor." Oryx left the chamber and walked down the long corridor alone. He did not think they would stop them at the border. He did not think the humans intended to be stopped. The UEEDC fleet crossed the breadth border on Wednesday. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no speeches broadcast to the fleet, no dramatic announcement. 1 second the ships were in human space. The next they were in breath space, and the war had moved somewhere it had never been before. Admiral Shen stood at the front viewport of his flagship's bridge and watched the star field, no different from the star field on the other side of an invisible line, stars and dark and the distant smear of a nebula, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "Navigation, confirm our course to the Hethvor system." Confirmed. Admiral estimated transit time to Heth V. 41 hours. Good. Maintain formation. Hethvor was the first major breath system inside the border. It had a population of about 600 million spread across 2 inhabited worlds and a large orbital station complex. It also had a significant military shipyard, one of the largest in the Empire outside the core systems. That shipyard was the reason it was first on the list. Shen had given orders that were very specific about Hethor and very specific about everything that followed. Military infrastructure was to be destroyed or captured. Military personnel were to be engaged. Civilian infrastructure was to be left alone. Civilian casualties were to be avoided wherever tactically possible. He had spent a long time on those orders. He had argued with himself about them. He had argued with 2 of his admirals who believed, not unreasonably, that the Breath deserved to have their cities bombed the way they had bombed human worlds. Shen had listened to those arguments, and he had said very calmly, "We are not doing that. Not because the Breath doesn't deserve it, because we are not going to become what came at us on that first Tuesday morning." One of the admirals had said, "With respect, sir, that kind of restraint will cost us." Shen had said, "Yes, it will. We're paying for it anyway." The order stood. The Battle of Hethf lasted 19 hours. The Vreth garrison defending the system was significant. The Emperor had recalled forces from across the border territories just as Orax had recommended. They fought well. The shipyard defense was particularly fierce because the crews defending it knew what losing it would mean. Vasquez commanded the secondary assault group, tasked with suppressing the orbital defense network, while Shen's carrier groups engaged the main Breath fleet. She had been doing this for over a year now. The rhythm of it was familiar in the way that difficult things become familiar after enough repetition. Not comfortable. Never comfortable. But known. She knew how to read her tactical display during an engagement, knew which signals meant a threat was developing and which were noisy, knew when to push and when to hold. The Breath at Hethf was good. She respected that without any ambiguity. They were fighting for their own territory now on their own ground, with the specific intensity that comes from defending something that is actually yours. It did not change the outcome. When the last Breath warship in the system was disabled or destroyed, Shen sent two things simultaneously. A salvage and repair team to assess the shipyard for capture rather than demolition, and a communication through the neutral diplomatic channels to Vreth Prime. The communication said the UEDC forces have engaged and neutralized the military garrison at Hethvar. Civilian populations and infrastructure are undamaged. This remains our policy. We request the Emperor to open direct communications. The response came from Brethren 6 hours later. It was from General Orax, not the Emperor, which was itself significant. Admiral Shen, the Emperor, is prepared to offer the following terms. Full withdrawal of UEDC forces from all Breath systems. Formal return of all occupied human worlds with documented reparations. A permanent demilitarized zone along the shared border. And a trade normalization agreement. The Empire acknowledges full responsibility for the initiation of hostilities. Shen read the message. He read it again. He showed it to Vasquez, who read it in silence. They're serious, Vasquez said. I know they're serious, Shen said. These are good terms, she said. From a practical standpoint, we already have our worlds back. The reparations would rebuild everything we lost. The buffer zone protects the border. Yes, Shen said. You're not going to accept them. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the star map, at the deep spread of Breath territory ahead of them. I need to make a call, he said. The call was to Secretary General Dilo. She was in Geneva when it came through, and she had already read the Breath message because copies had been distributed to the Security Council simultaneously. The council chamber was full of people who had very different opinions about what to do. She laid out the situation plainly. The Breath offer was real. The terms were substantial. From a pure material standpoint, accepting made logical sense. Diallo listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, What does your instinct tell you, Admiral? Shen thought about New Carthage, about Commander Tanaka's last transmission, about the 11,000 people in the first week, about the 200,000 dead across the whole opening phase of the war, about the colonies that had sat under Breath occupation for over a year with their people living under foreign rule and foreign law and foreign flags. He thought about the little girl at Harvest Station who had given tours of paper flower. He thought about what it meant in a galaxy full of civilizations to accept a negotiated settlement. Now, what lesson that taught? What the next civilization with 47,000 warships would think when they looked at that lesson. My instinct, he said, is that the terms are fair and insufficient. Dila was quiet for a moment. Explain insufficient, she said. Fair means we get everything back on paper, Shen said. Insufficient means that in 50 years, when the Empire has rebuilt and recovered, There is nothing to prevent them from deciding we're weak again. Nothing except a treaty. And a treaty is a piece of paper. He paused. I want to give them something better than a treaty. I want to give them a memory. Another silence. What kind of memory? Dio asked. The kind that lasts, he said. The kind that nobody forgets. The kind that every civilization in this galaxy can look at and understand the cost of starting a war with humanity. The Security Council debated for 6 hours. It was a real debate. There were people in that room who believed Shen was right and people who believed he was wrong, and both sides had serious arguments, and Diallo listened to all of them. At the end of 6 hours, she said, "Continue the campaign. But the moment they offer unconditional surrender, we stop and we negotiate. No civilian infrastructure, no mass casualties. We go in, we reach the capital, and we make the memory." Understood, Shen said. Understood. The UEDC fleet moved through Vreth space like something that could not be stopped, not because nothing stood against it. Breath ships met them at every major system along the route toward the core worlds. There were real battles, hard, costly engagements where UEDC ships were destroyed and crews died, and Shen sat in his command chair and updated the loss counts and kept going. But the direction never changed. The Breath strategy became clearer to Vasquez as the weeks passed. They were not trying to win anymore. They were trying to slow. They were pulling every available ship into defensive concentrations at the major systems, buying time, hoping that time would produce something. A diplomatic breakthrough, a political development on Earth, some change in the strategic picture that would give them a way out, that did not involve a UEDC fleet in orbit around Breath Prime. Nothing changed. The fleet moved through the Kesper corridor, past the sites of the early payback season strikes. They moved through the Orth system, where the largest deep space engagement of the campaign took place over 4 days of continuous fighting. They moved through the buffer systems, the fortress systems, the systems whose names Vasquez had been looking at on tactical maps for months, and was now seeing as navigational waypoints out the viewport. 8 weeks after crossing the border, the advanced elements of the UEDC fleet reached the berth inner systems, the home territories, the worlds that were old and densely populated, and at the heart of the Empire's history. These were not distant colonies. These were the worlds where British civilization had been born and grown and aged across 4,000 years of recorded history. They had never been touched by an enemy. They were about to be. General Orax made one last attempt to reach the Emperor on a personal level. He went to the chamber without an appointment, which was not done. He stood in front of the Imperial desk and said what he had been thinking for months. "You need to surrender unconditionally," he said. The Emperor looked up from his desk. "Unconditionally," he said very flatly. "Yes. Before they reach Vreth Prime, send the message now, and we can negotiate the actual terms from a position that still has some standing if they reach the capital." "They will not reach the capital," Kelvoth said. Orax wanted to put his head in his hands. He restrained himself. "My Emperor," he said with the particular careful patience of a man making one final attempt. "I have studied this species for 2 years. I know how they think and I know how they fight, and I know what they are doing and where they are going. They are coming here. They are going to come to this city, to this building, and they are going to make certain that we understand what we did and what it cost. That is the only outcome available to us. Now the only variable we can still affect is the condition in which they find us when they arrive. You are asking me to humiliate the Empire." The Emperor said, "I'm asking you to save it," Oryx said. A very long silence. "Get out," Kelvoth said. His voice was very quiet. Oryx got out. He walked down the corridor and out into the gardens and stood in the cold night air of Breath Prime for a long time, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the fleet was coming. He had read every human document he could find. He had read their history and their literature and their military records and their personal communications and their public speeches. He had spent 2 years trying to understand them. And he understood them now better than he understood most species he had studied, including his own. The humans were not coming to Vreth Prime to destroy it. They were coming to do something more lasting than destruction. They were coming to show the Emperor what his war had produced, to walk him through it, to make sure he knew in the specific and personal and undeniable way that cannot be accomplished by any document or treaty or diplomatic message what his decision had cost. In all his years and all his wars, Oryx had never seen a species do that. He had seen species destroy their enemies. He had seen species absorb their enemies. He had seen species humiliate their enemies. He had never seen a species do what the humans appeared to be planning. He thought it was in its way extraordinary. He thought it was also going to be the most useful thing that had happened to the VH Empire in 400 years. Whether the Emperor would survive the experience of learning it was another question entirely. The UEDC fleet arrived in the Brethren Prime system on a morning local time when the sun was just rising over the capital city's eastern districts. The sensor feeds from the orbital defense stations showed them coming in from the dark. Thousands of ships moved in formation, filling the long-range displays with contact signatures that seemed like they would never stop appearing. The defense stations opened fire. They fought until they were destroyed because the crews were breathless, and this was their homeworld, and they had no intention of doing anything else. The UEDC fleet absorbed the fire and closed the distance and dismantled the defense network over 14 hours of continuous engagement, and then it settled into orbit. A communication came down from the flagship. It was addressed to Emperor Chaos. It said simply, "We are here. Come out." The Emperor did not come out. For 22 hours, the UEDC fleet held position in orbit around Breath Prime and waited. Shen sent the message 3 more times, each one identical, each one through every available channel. The response from the palace was silence. The response from Breath Prime surface defense networks was sporadic ground-based fire that accomplished nothing except confirming that the Emperor intended to make them come to him. Shen ordered a precision ground strike on the surface defense batteries. Then he said to Vasquez, who was standing beside him on the flagship bridge, "I need you to go in." She had known this was coming. She had been preparing her ground element for 3 days. "How many troops do I have authorization to land?" she asked. "As many as you need," Shen said. But Alina. He used her first name, which he almost never did. When you find him, he walks out of that palace on his feet. Understood? He walks out. She understood. The UEDC ground force landed in the broad ceremonial plaza at the edge of the capital city, a space that had been designed for exactly this kind of moment, for imperial parades and celebrations and demonstrations of power. It had been built 12,200 years ago by a Breath Emperor who wanted the world to see the glory of his empire from a single vantage point. The plaza could hold 250,000 people. It had never held an enemy army. The Breath ground defense fought street by street through the outer districts of the capital. It was hard and costly fighting, narrower than space combat, closer, dirtier, slower. The Breath soldiers defending their capital were fighting for their home in the most literal sense possible, and they gave every meter at full price. Vasquez ran the ground operation from a mobile command post that moved with the advance, close enough to the front to get real information, but not so close as to be useless to anyone. She had learned in her years of military service that there is a particular quality to fighting in cities. It is different from space combat in every way except one. The decisions matter just as much and have to be made just as fast with even less information. She made those decisions, and she lived with each one, and she kept moving forward. The outer districts fell in 2 days. The inner districts closer to the Imperial complex took 3 more. On the 5th day after landing, the UEDC advance force reached the outer wall of the Imperial Palace complex. The Palace Guard was still active, still fighting. They were the Emperor's personal guard force. 800 soldiers with excellent equipment and the specific kind of motivation that comes from having sworn an oath to a specific person rather than to an abstract idea. They held the outer wall for most of the day. When it fell, Vasquez walked through the gate with 100 soldiers and entered the grounds of the Imperial complex. The gardens were exactly as beautiful as they looked in the documentation. Old trees shaped over centuries stood in careful rows. Stone paths wound through maintained greenery. Fountains that had been running for 1,000 years were still running. The palace itself, enormous, built from the dark blue stone of Breath Prime's northern mountain ranges, rose against the morning sky in a way that was genuinely impressive. She gave orders that nothing in the gardens was to be damaged. Her soldiers looked at her and did not ask questions. They found the Emperor in the throne room. Kelvoth had not fled. Vasquez had not been entirely sure he would stay. Every rational calculation suggested that he should have evacuated weeks ago, and the breath certainly had the capability to move him off-world. He had chosen to stay. She did not fully understand that choice until she walked into the throne room and saw him. He was seated in his throne, which was a massive structure of carved stone and dark metal that had held every breath of the Emperor for the last 800 years. He was in full imperial robes. His 4 copper eyes were level and completely steady. On either side of him, the last of his palace guards stood at attention. He looked like a man who had made a decision about how this moment would go and intended to hold to it. Vasquez stopped at the far end of the throne room. She looked at him for a moment. He was old, the most powerful being in an empire of 240 worlds, and he was old, and he had made a catastrophic mistake. And he was sitting in his throne because sitting in his throne was the only dignity he had left. She walked toward him, not running, not rushing. She walked at an ordinary pace down the length of the throne room and stopped 10 FT away. "Emperor Kelvoth," she said, "I am Commander Alina Vasquez of the United Earth Defense Corps, by the authority of the United Earth Government and the order of Secretary General Amara Diallo. You are placed under the jurisdiction of the UEEDC and the UN Security Council, pending formal proceedings." She paused. "You are going to come with me now," she said. "You are going to come with me, and you are going to walk on your own feet." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way something very old looks at something new that has just done something it did not believe was possible. Then he stood up from the throne. His guards moved slightly, and he raised a hand, and they went still. He came down from the dais slowly, not because he was afraid, but because he was 900 years old, and because some things need to be done at their own pace. He stopped in front of her. He was much taller than she was. He looked down at her with those 4 copper eyes, and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and he followed. Secretary General Diallo had been very specific about what came next. She had been specific about it for weeks, arguing for it in the Security Council, against the people who wanted a formal tribunal on Earth and the people who wanted an immediate and final settlement. She had fought for it in language that was, by her own admission, unusually passionate for someone known for measured diplomatic process. She had won the argument. What came next was this. The Emperor of the Vreth Empire was going to travel under UEEDC escort to every human world that his forces had attacked and occupied. He was going to see each one, not from orbit, on the ground, in person. He was going to see New Carthage, where the first attack had come and 300,000 people had lived in terror for 14 months. He was going to see Kepler Station, where the defense failed in 6 hours. He was going to see Harvest Station, where people had lived under occupation long enough to forget what ordinary life felt like. He was going to see every damaged settlement, every rebuilt memorial, every scar that the war had left on the worlds his empire had struck. He was going to see what he had done, not read about it, not receive a report about it, see it. The journey took 40 days. Vasquez accompanied the Emperor on every stop. She had been given the assignment by Shen, who had told her simply, "You know these worlds. You know what happened at each one. Make sure he understands what he's seeing." She had accepted the assignment without comment. The first stop was New Carthage. They landed in the main square of the Dome City, and Vasquez walked him through it. She told him what the city had been like before. She told him the figures, the hours it took to fall, the casualties, the occupation conditions. She introduced him to the colony administrator, a woman named Choi, who had managed the population through 14 months of breath rule, and who looked at Kaoth with the specific expression of someone who has many things to say and is choosing the silence instead. Kaoth looked at the city. He looked at the repaired structures, the new memorial in the main square, the people going about their days with the particular quality of people who are rebuilding something that was taken from them. He said nothing. At Kepler Station, they walked through the rebuilt orbital platform. The original structure had been mostly destroyed in the attack, and reconstruction had been ongoing for over a year. Vasquez showed him the section that was still under repair, where you could see the new metal bonded to the old, the repair lines tracing the exact shapes of the damage. She showed him the memorial wall, 612 names, each one a person who had been alive before the war started. Kelvath stood in front of the memorial wall for a long time. At Harvest Station, something happened that was not in anyone's plan. They were walking through the rebuilt main settlement when a group of children came out of a school building on a regular afternoon release and ran directly into the path of the small procession. The children pulled up short and stared at the enormous gray-blue alien in the imperial robes walking down their street with an escort of UEDC soldiers. One of the children, a girl of about 7, looked at the Emperor for a moment, and then looked at Vasquez and said very directly, "Is that him? Is that the one who started the war?" Vasquez said, "Yes." The girl looked at the Emperor. She said, "My dad was at Kepler Station," and she walked away back to her friends with the complete and total indifference of a child who has said what needed to be said and has other things to do. Kaoth watched her go. Something moved in his 4 copper eyes, something that Vasquez, who had been watching him for 40 days, had not seen before. On the last day of the journey, at the last stop, Vasquez and the Emperor stood in the ruins of the orbital defense hub on New Carthage. The original structure, the one Commander Tanaka had fought from, which had been left deliberately unrestored as a memorial. The metal was dark and broken. The consoles were destroyed. The hall was open to space behind a transparent memorial barrier, showing the exact shape of the damage from 9 hours of battle. Vasquez had a recording. She had never played it for him before. She had been saving it. She played it now through the small speaker on her comm unit. Tanaka's last transmission. 31 seconds. The sound of the hub breaking apart in the background and Tanaka's voice very steady saying, "Hold the line. Whatever you do, hold the line." The recording ended. The silence in the destroyed hub was very deep. Kaoth stood completely still for a long time. Then he said for the first time in 40 days, something that was not a response to a direct question. "I did not know," he said quietly, "that your species fought like that." Vasquez looked at him for a moment. "Now you know," she said. The formal proceedings took place on Earth in Geneva, 6 weeks after the tour ended. The full UN Security Council, ambassadors from every human world, representatives of 14 other civilizations who had been watching the war and its aftermath, with the specific close attention of species who were thinking very carefully about what lessons to take from it. Kalivoth sat across a table from Secretary General Diallo, and they negotiated for 9 days. The final settlement included everything the Vreth had originally offered: reparations, trade normalization, the permanent demilitarized zone, and several things they had not. The Vreth Empire acknowledged full and unconditional responsibility for the war. A joint memorial was to be established on New Carthage, maintained by both civilizations. Annual delegations of Wreath officials were to visit the human memorial worlds for 50 years. And one more thing, which Diallo had insisted on, and which had taken the longest to agree to the tour, the Emperor's 40-day walk through the ruins he had helped create, was to be published in full. Every recording, every stop, every moment, including the little girl at Harvest Station, was to be released to every civilization in the known galaxy. Not as propaganda, as a record, as a thing that had happened and was true and would be true forever. Kelvoth signed the settlement documents on the 9th day. He signed them with a steady hand. He was very old, and he had just been through something that had changed the shape of his understanding of the universe, and he signed the documents with the specific gravity of a being who knows that what he is writing will be read for centuries. Vasquez was in Geneva for the signing. She stood in the back of the chamber and watched it happen, and felt the strange, specific feeling of something that has been running for a long time finally coming to a stop. Not victory in the way the word is usually used, something more complicated, something more like truth. After the chamber cleared, she walked outside into the Geneva morning. The lake was bright in the autumn sunlight. The city was going about its business in the way that cities do, indifferent to history being made nearby, full of people living their ordinary days. She thought about Tanaka. She thought about the 11,000 in the first week. The 200,000 across the war toss with his paper flower. The little girl at Harvest Station. She thought about Kauth standing in front of the memorial wall at Kepler Station for a very long time. She thought about what Shen had said months ago in that small office at Fort Estisis. They don't know us very well. They knew now. Every civilization watching from the edge of the conflict had seen the same thing. A species that fought back. A species that went all the way. A species that after it had won did not destroy its enemy, but walked their emperor through the rubble of what he had started and made him look at it until he understood. Not just a military victory, a message. And the message was this: if you come for us, we will come back. We will come all the way back. We will come to your capital and your throne room, and we will find you. And you will walk on your own feet through the thing you created. Not because we are cruel, because we remember. Because we always remember. 40 light years away on Breath Prime, General Aura stood in his office and read the final settlement documents and looked at the footage of the signing ceremony. He watched Kalavoth sign. He watched the human officials across the table. He looked at the footage of the 40-day tour that was now being broadcast to 14 civilizations. He thought about the little girl at Harvest Station. He thought about Tanaka's last transmission. He had spent 2 years studying humanity, and he thought he understood them well. He thought he understood at least the most important thing about them. They were not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest, or the most technologically advanced, or the most numerous. But they were the species that, when pushed hard enough, pushed back without limit, without ceiling, without the particular kind of calculation that makes most species stop before they go all the way. Most species, when they have won enough, stop. When the cost of continuing exceeds the clear military necessity, they stop. Humans did not stop until the thing was finished, until the last occupied world was free, until the Emperor was standing in the ruins he had ordered, until the message was sent not just to the Breath but to everyone watching. Oryx sat down at his desk and began writing the report that he would eventually present to the Imperial Council. He would recommend a permanent policy of non-aggression toward humanity. He would recommend a genuine study of human history, not for military intelligence, but for understanding. He would recommend that the Varith Empire, for the first time in its 4,000-year history, treat another species as a peer. He would recommend it because he had watched humanity fight a war and then end it without cruelty, without mass destruction, without the kind of absolute victory that would have been easy and available and would have made the lesson different. He would recommend it because the most impressive thing the humans had done in his view was not the fleet they built or the battles they won. It was 40 days. It was the choice to take an enemy emperor by the arm and walk him through the damage and say, "Look at what you did," instead of you being finished. That choice had sent a message that no military victory could have sent alone. It said that humans were worth respecting, not fearing, respecting, which in Oryx's long experience was the only basis for a peace that actually lasted. He wrote the report. Outside on Breath Prime, the sun was rising. Somewhere far away across the border, on the worlds that had been rebuilt and liberated and returned to the people they belonged to, other suns were also rising. The war was over. What came after was